for anyone who is not back in the pavilion, if you could start filtering in as we get started with our next presentation. Equally important to horse safety is the health of our riders. And as part of a long-term plan to modernize weight rooms, the British Horseracing Authority in November of 2021 announced the removal of all saunas and developed a set of minimum standards for jockeys' quarters. In January of this year, the BHA followed the sauna removal with a 2-pound increase in the minimum weights for both jump and flat races. I'd now like to welcome Dr. Jerry Hill, Chief Medical Advisor for the British Horseracing Authority, to discuss supporting our human athletes and present on jockey weights, well-being, and fitness.
So, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for that introduction, and my thanks to Jamie and the Jockey Club for inviting me all the way from London to come and talk with you today. I've got a few declarations for you. I think one of the first things to say is I'm sorry there's another Brit on the stage, so apologies for that. I'm also not a vet, so that really begs the question, what on earth am I doing here today? The other minor point, I actually haven't ridden a horse since I was 11, so don't judge me on that too much. So why am I here? I'm here to talk about the other athlete. That will be the human athlete, the jockey. And I'm just going to run through some comments so I can share the experiences we've had in the UK with you guys here, and hopefully there'll be some mutual learning. So GB racing involves an awful lot of stakeholders. I guess it's probably the same over here in the States as well. And there's a list of them here on the stage, on the screen here. And one of the interesting things about COVID, one of the many, many interesting things about COVID, is actually as an industry, we got together and we actually started to talk to each other better than perhaps we'd ever done before. And that's one of the things, hopefully, which will be a legacy of COVID, that we will continue to actually talk to each other rather than work in silos. So on the screen, as I say, there's a number of stakeholders there, and you've got these sort of operational ones at the top, so that's ourselves at the BHA, colleagues from the Professional Jockeys Association, the Injured Jockeys Fund, which are our main supporting charity to help with the injuries, colleagues from the RCA, and then we move into training with a couple of training colleges, and we actually have quite a lot of academic partners now, because we certainly facilitate research in the UK into our jockey athletes. So I started racing, it's 20 odd years ago now, working on the racetracks, providing trauma care to jockeys. And in the run-up to the London 2012 Olympics, I retrained in sports medicine and started to work as a sports physician, both in football and continuing to work in racing. Sorry, when I say football, you probably know that's soccer. We call it proper football in the UK. So I worked in proper football, and I worked for proper football clubs, and I worked for the national squads. And I worked for the FA, and working at the FA, it was a very interesting experience because when you work for a national squad, actually, there are no limitations on resource. And so actually, what you want, you tend to get. And they were developing at the time this 4-corner model for training the developing athlete. So that was looking at the technical and tactical side of things, the psychological, the physical, and the social. And actually, to be honest, in the UK in the early years, we were pretty good at the technical and tactical. We were pretty poor at the physical. And this came to light. I brought a development squad to the US, and we were much better technically, but they walloped us. And they walloped us because they ran and ran and ran. And it occurred to me that actually what we need to be doing is actually developing the physical side of our athletes and not just looking at the technical and tactical side of things. So translating that, we begin to think, well, actually, could we transfer this into racing? And at the time, I was relatively new into racing and naively thought, well, that's great, I'll go in and save the world. But actually, a lot of it was already happening. And you can see on here that these are the sort of subsections within that 4-corner model. Clearly, the stuff in the red box is all about football. But a lot of the other stuff really does apply to our jockey athletes. So we began to think about jockeys as athletes. And this was a bit of a shift, because up until that point, jockeys were just jockeys, they were riders, they were jockeys. But as soon as you start to treat them as elite athletes, that brings a shift in mindset, And it begins a shift in mindset amongst them as individuals, but also amongst those who work around them. If you're an elite athlete, you expect and you deserve a certain level of support, whether that's strength and conditioning, physiotherapy, nutrition, psychology, the whole 9 yards. So changing the name actually became really quite a useful thing. At the time, I had a conversation with the English Institute of Sport about something called talent transfer. And we were looking about, okay, how do we get more jockeys coming into the sport? And the English Institute of Sport said to me, oh, that's great, okay, just tell me what benchmarks do people wanting to become a jockey have to reach? It was actually quite a short conversation because we didn't have any benchmarks at all. I think I mumbled something, well, it'd be quite nice if they were able to make weight, but actually we didn't know much more about it. And so what's happened, and we still have it running, there's a PhD running at John Moores University in Liverpool called Defining the Jockey Athlete. And we're trying to work out what are the characteristics of a successful jockey. That's from a physical point of view, physiologically, psychologically. So that's work in progress. Clearly there's some stuff which is self-evident and actually are relatively unique to jockeys compared to other athletes. They're self-employed. They're single athletes. They're not a team sport, and that always makes it more difficult to train them, but there are plenty of other single athletes around. They have this, in the UK, this relentless schedule, not just from a racing and competition point of view, but actually they tend to hold full-time jobs as well, so they will get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, they will ride out, they will muck out, and eventually they might go racing in the afternoon. So that schedule, 363 days a year, is absolutely relentless. And it involves driving all over. Okay, it's not a very big country I live in, but actually, if you're driving several hundred miles for a single ride, it's a big country. And then there's the weight. Okay, weights. So I was always told if you do a presentation, try and get a picture of a cute animal into it. So here's my picture of a cute animal. But it's the elephant in the room. And I'm absolutely not saying that a jockey looks like an elephant standing on scales. But weight's a funny thing in racing because we talk about it a lot, and actually we don't talk about it a lot. And it's been a bit of an issue. During COVID, when we stood down for 6 weeks and we managed to get the racing going again, I had a conversation with a jockey who'd come back. And at the time, as we'd come to, we'd lifted the weights because of the absence of saunas. And I remember having this conversation with the jockey, and up until that stage, going into the changing room where the jockeys were was a bit of a scary event because they were usually not very happy people. And I went in there and it was actually a changed environment. And I was speaking to one of the jockeys and he was describing his definition of success. And prior to COVID, his definition of success was getting on the scales and making weight. It was not how he performed on the racetrack. It was not where he was placed in the race. Success was making weight. And I thought that was really sad for a professional athlete. And it's one of those things that we definitely need to address that. So what about weights? Where are we? Okay, so this is the story of minimum flat weights in the UK. And as you can see, we started at an incredibly low weight in the 70s of 7 stone, 7 pounds. And it has gradually crept up over time, and it goes up probably a couple of pounds every 10 years if you're going to average it out. And you can see that numbers are starting to appear in brackets on this slide, and they start to appear because this is the allowances that begin to become introduced for safety equipment. So these are extra weight allowed at scales. So this is not declared to the racing public. So 2012, there was an extra couple of pounds because back then we were using a level 1 body protector. I think you're still using in the States, so the Tipperary is a common example of that. And then in 2018, we increased it to a level 2, so a heavier body protector, and they got an extra £3 at scales, which is quite interesting because the body protector over time, as the technology has improved, the weight has actually come down. So actually, your body protector gives you 1.2 pounds of weight. So there you go. You've already got a bonus there because actually you get more than you expect. So what happened in 2020? Well, apparently a virus appeared in 2020, which caused us all a lot of stress. And one of the things we had to do at that point is to really nail down the infection control in racecourses because we had the spectre that actually public health authorities said if we had a single case in an enclosed environment on the racecourse, everyone in that space would be quarantined for 14 days. And it only takes a few of those in a crowded jockey's changing room before you go, actually, we'd run out of jockeys, we cannot race. So as a consequence, saunas were closed. As you will learn, I'm not very upset that saunas were closed, but they were closed nonetheless. And we really quickly had to come out with some compensation for the absence of saunas. The other absence was gyms in the UK were also closed, and so that was another opportunity for jockeys not to be able to make weight easily. So they told me, it's all right, Doc, we only lose a couple of pounds in the saunas. Yes, of course you do, I said. But nonetheless, that's what they said, and so a £3 weight allowance came in. So suddenly at scales, they were getting £6 extra. 3 for the body protector, 3 for the absence of saunas and gyms. And that, in combination with the fact we restrict them to a single race meeting a day, was transformative for their attitude and well-being. So actually, COVID in that respect, lots of other troubles, but COVID in that respect was actually quite helpful to the jockeys. Now, latterly, we've been through another post-COVID debate about what we're doing about weights, and what you see on the screen is where we are now. So minimum weights across both flat and jump codes have gone up by £2, so 8 stone 2 for the flat and 10 stone 2 for the jumps, and we've arrived at an extra £4 personal allowance, which is given at scales. Now that's all very well, but actually if you look at the picture, jockeys do come in different heights, okay, and we apply the same set of rules regardless of your height. So if you just hold that thought, because that's something which is important. So whenever you talk about weights, people go, yeah, population's getting bigger. So it's getting bigger, and therefore, actually, you must put the weights up. And it's not an incorrect argument. So on this slide here, you see we've got ourselves, colleagues in Ireland, because we work very closely with the Irish, and we put the Dutch on here. And the Dutch are on here because they are the giants of Europe. Okay, and so these are the really tall people. So yes, over the last 100 years, people have got taller. However, they've actually stopped getting taller in the UK. Actually, they stopped getting taller in the 80s, probably something to do with the music at the time. But anyway, they've stopped getting taller. So actually, it's a little bit of a spurious argument. So you just have to be careful, look at your stats carefully. The other thing which has happened, of course, is that people are getting bigger. Well, actually, when you say bigger, you mean fatter, and actually BMI is going up. So congratulations, United States. Here you are, top of this graph, to show that actually you guys are getting bigger. But remember, all these graphs are to do with the population of the whole country, not necessarily the population of your sport, of your industry. And actually, I can tell you that the population of jockeys, they are getting taller. I know because they're taller than me, and obviously I'm 6'8". So you know, they are getting bigger. So it is an important argument. The other thing which is really important is this. So this is don't worry, it's the only sort of vaguely stat slides we're going to have on here. So this is a normal distribution. You'll be familiar with this. 2 important points in this. So first off, there are 2 genders on here, okay? And one of the great things about racing in the UK is that men and women compete on equal basis, more or less. It's not entirely true. There are still less women in the sport than there should be, but there are more coming in. But they are shorter than men. And bearing in mind that largely your ability to make weight has a relationship with your height, and of course your height is your genetic potential plus your nutritional state, then actually women have a considerable advantage over the chaps. But actually, if you look at the normal distribution even for the men, it's got quite a wide base to it. And actually, if I was to recruit jockeys from the entire population of the UK, I would find plenty at the left-hand end of that curve, at the shorter end of the curve, where I could actually find jockeys to easily make weight. The problem is, that's not the population we're recruiting from. So recruitment is an important issue that I'll come back to. So before COVID hit, there was lots of conversations and talking to my colleagues at John Moores University who do a lot of our racing research about our population. And looking at our apprentice jockeys, as you can see here, this is a paper that we published on the apprentice jockeys. And essentially what we were saying even before COVID was that actually the weights were too low for actually most of our participants who were already involved in the sport, who already embarked on their career to actually make weights. And looking at the numbers there, in the time period looked at, there were 41 apprentices who had joined the sport, 32 of them went up to John Moore's, and they all had their body composition done. And even if we reduced their body fat down to 2.5 kg, which to be honest is pretty low, it should really be about 5 kg, most of them were not going to be able to make weight with the current weight structure. And what we were doing, we were almost writing their destiny for them, which was to say, actually, you're going to have to do things which are not good for your body to make weight. And as a medic, that's a really difficult thing to accept. Interesting, during COVID, when the weights went up and this service still continued at John Moore's, the next cohort came along, none of them turned up dehydrated for their assessment, whereas the ones in the original study did. So there was already a short-term gain. So what about making weight? Making weight, so the elephant in the room. So these are the ways that you'll all be familiar with of how jockeys make weight, and there's a heavy bias towards dehydration. So that's everything from fluid restriction to saunas or hot boxes, as you call them in the States, salt baths, burying yourself in your neck in piles of manure, and generally sweating to actually try and get your weight down. Interesting, flipping is an issue in the UK. You know, it's allegedly we imported it from the States. I'm not sure that's true or fair, but flipping, self-induced vomiting does go on. And actually COVID gave us a little bonus on that because we were able to ban flipping. Because flipping involved vomiting. If you vomited on a racecourse during COVID, you were thought to have COVID and you immediately stood down for 14 days. And actually, interestingly, we had less, we didn't have known, but we had less flipping on the racecourses. The other thing which has been an issue in the past about laxatives and diuretic use, that has largely faded away in the UK. That's principally down to anti-doping, because we now pick them up. So dehydration, why were we worried about dehydration? Well, we reviewed the literature again, and we produced a position statement for ourselves as an authority and also the university. And you can see the detail of it on the screen. But essentially, if you dehydrate yourself between 2 and 4%, which for a jockey is not very much, we can begin to measure things which are bad for your performance. Okay, health as well, but performance. So your reaction time is poor. Your power drops down. Your ability to ride safely is reduced. So actually, if you're making poor decisions and actually you can't ride safely, you're not going to do very well and you're going to fall off. Also, anecdotally, from my docs who work on the race courses, they were reporting actually they frequently pick up jockeys who are riding light because actually, why have they picked them up? Because they've fallen off. And they will often appear to be concussed. They're not. They're just very dehydrated. And sometimes they appear to be shocked, as if they've had a large bleed. They haven't. And that's a bit embarrassing when you get helicoptered to the nearest major trauma centre to find out the reason you're there is because you're dehydrated. What we do know is that actually, if you access, and we have an extraordinary support network in the UK of nutrition and other support services, if you access that, then actually you can make weight relatively safely. So the conclusion, essentially, we worked out, not rocket science, dehydration is bad. Acute dehydration causes problems. And actually, to encourage that by providing saunas on racecourses really was very difficult to accept, in the same way as you wouldn't now give people a couple of shots of bourbon before they sat on the racecourse, because it does affect your ability to race safely. Now, of course, what we can't do is control what people do outside the racecourse, but actually we need to create an environment within the racecourse where actually we can encourage people to do the right thing. So dehydration, we were trying absolutely to discourage it, and actually COVID was quite helpful in that endeavour. But it's not all dehydration. There are other things which you do to try and make weight. And some of those are good and some of those are bad. So a controlled diet and exercise program under supervision clearly is a good thing to do to help with your weight. Calorie restriction, food restriction, fasting is not good. And all of those things will have potentially negative effects on your health. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of those. So mood and bones we're just going to talk about. Okay, so a lot of these studies are quite old now. A lot of these studies are from 8-10 years ago. So this is a study, again from colleagues in Liverpool, where we looked at jockeys who were making weight using traditional methods, okay? And amongst a whole load of other measures, we did their Brunel mood score, which looks at certain parameters, including anger, confusion, depression, fatigue, tension, and vigor. And as you can see here on the graph, you've got 3 lines. You've got what you're aiming for, so that is the normal curve, when you've got low levels of the negative parameters and high levels of vigor. And then you've got the assessments done on flat and jump jockeys. And as you can see, that actually, particularly the flat jockeys, they had high levels of what you're not looking for, so the depression, the anxiety, and they had low levels of vigor and energy. And that's what really sort of echoed what common sense tells you, is because certainly as a doctor, if you pick up a jockey who's just fallen off a horse, they are not very happy people. If you drill down that to a bit more detail and actually go into formally looking at markers of mental health problems, again, this is a really top-level summary, but you can see here, so on this chart, green is good, red is bad, and orange is somewhere in the middle. And again, this cohort of jockeys who are actually having their mental health assessed, you can see that significant numbers of jockeys making weights in the traditional fashion had markers of problems with their mental health when you compare it to other weight-making sports and the general public at the time. If we move on to bones, and it's really interesting hearing about the equine side of the bone side of things, but we've had repeated studies, because we often use DEXAs to look at body composition, which obviously gives you a bone density score at the same time, that actually low bone density, osteopenia and osteoporosis is more common in our jockey group than we'd like it to be, and it seems to be particularly prevalent in male flat jockeys, which of course is not what you'd expect from osteoporosis, which is traditionally the older females who run into problems with it. Now, one of the difficulties is actually a difficulty of diagnosis here, because when you're doing a DEXA scan and you're looking at bone density, you then compare your scores to get a control population. And you can either do that against a control population matched by age and gender, or a general control. And the difficulty is we are probably not comparing our jockeys to actually a relevant control group, and we may be over-diagnosing their low bone density. But if you think about it, we're in a sport when horses are travelling at 35, 40 miles an hour, you're going to fall from at least 2 or 3 meters up. Actually, you want good bone density. You don't want it to be in the negative half of the curve. So it is work in progress, and of course what we're really interested in is, can we find a level at which bone density is low that you will fracture when you take, quote, a soft fall? Clearly, if you fall at high speed, even if your bones are made of titanium, you're going to break them. But actually it's those softer falls, and we are seeing an increase in the number of spinal fractures in the UK, partly I suspect because of increased diagnostics, because we tend to MR a lot of our spinal guys now. But you can reverse these things. So we know that actually, if you do the right thing in terms of a diet and exercise program, you can reduce your body fat absolute amount and body fat percentage down. And interestingly, even our jockeys who, if you look at them, look quite slight, look quite slim, were bringing in body fat percentages in the low teens. If you're a professional footballer, you want it 8 or 9%, and these guys were bringing in, 14 to 16%. So you can get it down. And again, we know you can get it down in this group because we've done studies on it. And there was a study where we looked at giving jockeys a controlled diet. So the diet, their food was delivered. It was a high protein diet. They ate 6 times a day. They were not hungry. They were not dehydrated. And surprise, surprise, they got their fat mass down. But they preserved muscle bulk, which is always the big issue, that if you do rapid fasting, you lose muscle bulk and you lose muscle strength. And also, their mental health scores improved as well. So if you're well-fed and hydrated, then actually it's good for your well-being in the broadest sense. The difficulty is that a lot of these guys still have a slightly unusual arrangement with the food. Not quite, in many cases, heading towards a formal eating disorder, but we do see more of that than we'd like to. So the challenge is this, that we have a level, an individual threshold below which you can't reduce your weight any further without actually incurring risk. So what are we actually going to do about it? What could be done about it? Okay, so number one, this is the one we've effectively done so far. So we raise the weights and we promote methods other than dehydration. So this is what COVID gave us an opportunity to do. But we know that every time you raise weights, you enter this honeymoon period where it's great for a while, but then eventually you're going to have to do it again, hence that stepwise increase in weights. Other couple of options are looking actually at individual minimum weights, and some countries require these now. So colleagues in Ireland and France will require this. So you are set a minimum weight as a jockey based on some equation, and that might be based on body composition, where actually you're not allowed to ride below that weight. And that's, in theory, great. And introducing and actually running that would be really quite challenging, because you would potentially, at a stroke, remove the opportunity for lots of current riders, current jockeys to ride at weights they've been riding at for years. So scientifically sensible, a challenge to introduce. And then the other things I alluded to earlier is looking at the recruitment side of things. You know, we probably need to be looking away from our current population to recruit from elsewhere. So back to dear old COVID. Okay, so COVID came to an end. I know because Boris Johnson told me COVID had come to an end. And he had some parties in Downing Street to celebrate the end of COVID, which was great. So we then had to reach a point where we're going to have to get rid or rename the COVID £3 allowance as it become known by then. So with all these things, you know, in GB racing, we all meet, we have lots of people get together and people present their point of view. The Professional Jockey Association consulted their members and actually had a really significant response rate, and 180 responses from their members, which is well over half of their membership, was pretty extraordinary. And the thing about it is that actually the jockeys generally had felt better through this time, and as I say, that was partly because they were no longer dehydrated using saunas, but also because they had one meeting a day. Some were still using dehydration themselves, and the split there is that 30% of them were using it once a week and 10% were dehydrating every time they raced. But the vast majority felt better. Small number wanted saunas back, and a large number said, yeah, we're happy without saunas returning as long as we carry on with the status quo. So carry on with the weight allowance, but also we'd like the food to be better, which was slightly unkind because the food had been improving, but we'll come back to that. And also we'd like some warm-up areas, which was a policy which was already in its sort of early stages. From the BHA point of view, I presented the medical evidence, which is basically dehydration is bad, can we please avoid it, work out some other way of doing it, and of course raising the weights was part of that. And my sense was to actually roll the COVID allowance over and rename it in some fashion was the sensible thing to do, at least in the short term. Colleagues in the racing department then looked at the performance side of things, because there was always a concern that actually, was the horse performance reduced in some way? And they looked at the percentage of runners beaten by rank in handicap races across jump racing, hurdles, and on the flat. And actually found no discernible difference in the 3 years prior to COVID and the year of COVID. So actually, horse performance was not affected. The handicappers were very pleased because actually these are all handicap races, and the spread, as you can see in the handicap, is very tight around the 50% mark, which is what they were aiming for. So horse performance not affected. And for the vets here in the audience, which of course is most of you, we asked the vets what they thought, and they said, actually, we can't see any problem with this increased weight. And this is, of course, at which point everyone goes, well, actually, when they're riding out, they carry someone who's 10.5 stone anyway. But, of course, riding out and race riding is slightly different, I would suggest. But nonetheless, it's an important part. National Trainers Federation consulted their members. There was some concern from them because, actually, when a horse doesn't do well, it's quite an easy thing to identify that's because it was carrying more weight than you wanted them to carry. So there was some horse trading over that. And what we came out with initially, despite some of the recommendations from many of us, was actually that the minimum weights would go up by £2, and the allowance scales would stay the same at £3. So if you cast your mind back, previously they had a total of 6 at scales, and now jockeys were given a total of 5 at scales. And surprisingly, that actually didn't go down terribly well with the jockeys, actually, because they said, well, actually, we think we'd asked for one thing, and you've given us something slightly different here. And to be fair, this was a full consultation process, and I guess it's one of the lessons we learned, that actually sometimes people are given the opportunity to give an opinion, and often they don't. And when there's a decision made that they don't agree with, then they give their opinion, by which time this full process had gone through. So it was really quite difficult. However, one of the things that had come out of COVID is actually we'd learned to talk to each other. So in fact, we carried on talking to each other, and actually a compromise was reached, which is still being discussed. So now actually the jockeys get an extra £4 personal allowance at scales. All the weights have gone up by £2. So by my maths, 2 plus 4 equals 6. So it hasn't changed. It has a bit, if I'm being honest with you, because previously the weight was at scales and wasn't beforehand. And that is an important difference for the jockeys. But with this dialogue still going on, and we've got some more meetings coming up. So the saunas have gone, and we now have a total of £6 weight allowance for that. So the other thing they were asking at the jockeys was, we'd like better food on the racecourses. So that was a bit unkind, because actually we'd working hard with a policy on better food on the racecourses for some time. And racecourses are obliged to follow some diet programs which has been set up. They are inspected against them. To be fair, it had slipped during COVID. And actually last week I had a phone call about Doncaster Racecourse. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't mention the name. But actually I had a complaint from one of the jockeys that the chips were soggy. I said, that's interesting. I don't care that they're soggy. I care that there are chips on the menu, because that's not part of the programme. But there you go. Okay, so it is coming along. We have really good support from the nutrition team. Around the UK, we have 3 injured jockey fund rehab centres, which are state-of-the-art physio-run rehab centres, and nutrition teams work out of there, and John Moores University. The nutrition team will visit each of the racecourses in the UK to help development food, and they also go to the training colleges, Northern Horse Racing College and British Racing School, to actually teach jockeys. And they teach jockeys how to shop, they teach them how to cook, and they teach them how to actually follow a good diet. So, there's a lot of sport out there, but dehydration is still embedded in the psyche, I'm afraid, of many jockeys, so that's work in progress. The other thing that's happened is that, as mentioned in the introduction, we've now got this very large rebuilding program in all racecourses in the UK. So over the next couple of years, they're all having to reconfigure their facilities, and that's to accommodate, great news, increasing female jockeys, because at the moment female jockeys probably get 2 foot square of changing room, and the males get something like 30 foot square. So there's going to be a balance there to allow more female jockeys. We've also have to introduce areas for safeguarding, so that's for the under 18s for change. And from my point of view, we are going to be getting warm-up areas, mini gyms, if you will, as well as enhancing rest areas and canteens. As part of that program, colleagues at the Injured Jockeys Fund, there's a chap called Danny Haig, who is really pushing a lot of the strength and conditioning programs. So he's devised this ramp program, which is a warm-up program for jockeys racing on a race day. So gone are the days when warm-up for a jockey was actually reading the racing post and having a fag. They're actually going to start behaving like athletes from other sports, I hope. And so there's a list of minimum equipment that racecourses are going to have. There's a minimum area of the warm-up area. So there will be some warm-up bikes, some free weights, some pulley systems, some TheraBands. So it's going to be very exciting if you find that sort of thing exciting. So we're really looking now increasingly at the physical profiling of our athletes. So coming back to the earlier comment when I said I didn't know what the attributes of a successful jockey were, we're working on that now. And so what we're trying to do is to learn more about our participants, and physical profiling days take place at the Injured Jockeys Fund centres. And we're doing that for 2 reasons. One is for the sport, so we can learn about the demands of the sport. We can understand the career pathway, and also can we try and deliver a healthy jockey into retirement, because retirement's a really challenging area for most sports. And then at the individual level, to identify gaps in their performance, to try and support them in their training, because, you know, it's our belief if you're robust, if you're stronger, if you're fitter, you're faster, you're actually going to perform better, but actually you're going to have less injuries, partly because you're probably going to fall off less, but actually when you do fall off, the way you impact with the ground and how you subsequently rehab is going to be improved if your basic fitness is better. On the screen there, you can see there are two areas which are highlighted, because most of the physical profiling is voluntary, and actually the jockeys are really engaged with it because they like to show off. They like to show they're fitter than their mate, and actually that's been really good introducing competition. But actually, if you want to enter the sport, you have to hit some fitness criteria before we actually let you in. And actually, if you've been injured before you return after injury, it's not just because your orthopedic surgeon says your bone's healed. It's actually, is it functionally working, and have you regained all your fitness? And so they will have a general fitness test as well. So there are two mandatory tests. The majority, as I say, is voluntary, but it has good take-up. And if you want the technical stuff, this is the stuff we look at in profiling. So this is to do with looking at power, endurance, strength. We look at body composition. We look at coordination as well. And we're trying to establish what are the normal ranges for jockeys at different stages of their development. So this is a nice simple one. So this is the push-up. Okay, as you can see there, we're developing normal ranges for both genders, but also for different stages in the jockey's career, and then we can grade them within that. Okay, so this is all descriptive at the moment, but it's really to help us actually define our population from a physical performance side. And then we will be working towards a structure here where you can see as you progress through, we'll begin to be able to populate this table with what your targets should be at any particular stage of your training career. So physical profiling is really coming in and actually is beginning to show dividends. So I thought, just in case anyone's beginning to doze off, I'm now going to play some loud music. Apologies for this. This was drawn up by Richard Perham, who's one of our jockey coaches, who clearly likes a bit of rock. And this is the entry-level test to when you come into racing. If you do not pass this, you have to go away and come back later.
The exercise ball squats.
So these are all tests which have been developed just based on common sense.
20 squats holding a 5 kilo weight.
It's taken from other
Hold the final
sports,
squat for 3 minutes.
and it's trying to mimic some of the issues that we see in racing. So you'll see a lot of this sort of
plank.
position.
Hold your plank with a straight line going from your shoulders through to your hips, through to your ankles, and hold this for up to 4 minutes. The elastic push. This exercise is set to a metronome at 50 beats per minute. For every beat, you must extend your hand fully forwards. This exercise lasts for 2 minutes. The wobble cushion squats.
If anyone's kid
Standing
wants
on
to
two
join
wobble
in,
cushions,
feel
adopt
free
the
to stand
push
up and do
position.
this at the same time.
Bend your knees so your thigh is horizontal to the ground. You will need to maintain this static position for a maximum of 4 minutes. Leg raisers. The leg raisers are set to a metronome beat of 50 beats per minute. 1 beat is up, 1 beat is down. Continue this for up to 4 minutes. press up hold position. Adopt a press up position with your hands facing forwards under your shoulders with your elbows close to your side. Hold this position for up to 90 seconds. You can see the correct position from the front. The Watt Bike warm-up. During your warm-up, pedal for 3 minutes at an average of 100 watts. You will then be ready for your Watt Bike test.
So I won't bore you with the Watt Bike test as well. So these are the minimum criteria, and we expect you to do better than this as you progress through your career. The other thing which is not shown on there, there's also an exerciser test as well at the end of that. So there you are. So you're on your license course, and you've been taught how to cook, you've been taught how to shop, you've known how to use the gym, and your fitness has been assessed. The other thing, if you think back to that four-corner model, was looking at your psychological state. And we're now beginning to introduce psychologists in as a routine part of care. And we're trying to actually move away from this sense that people find it difficult to talk about their mental health. So we were introducing it at the beginning, and colleagues at Sporting Chance and Changing Minds, who are our providers for mental health, are working hard to do this for us. So each applicant for the licensing course will have a one-to-one conversation with the psychologist, and they also undergo scoring of anxiety and depression scores. So if you look at this here, you can see that actually, as usual, red is less good, purple in this screen is fine, and blue is somewhere in between. And this is at the license courses. We're seeing that actually about 30% of people are showing signs of anxiety. We have evidence of some depression, and putting it together, around about a third of our applicants are actually already showing signs of some distress. So is this an issue? If you then move to actually compare it with others, so on the left here, you've got the license course applicants with their third. You've then got a column which reflects a study from Ireland, where actually they looked at, this was an anonymous questionnaire which went to all their licensed jockeys, and they found that for those who responded, which was about a 50% response rate, up to 70% of their respondees had some sort of mental health issue. Now, there was a significant skew towards alcohol misuse, which is not measured in the license courses. But nonetheless, this is fairly significant. I would take it with a little bit of a pinch of salt, because the response rate actually will mean there's a bit of a selection bias here, because you're probably going to have people who've got an issue who are responding. But nonetheless, even if you wind it back, at best, we do have a selection in the Irish population of probably approaching 30-35% of people with a discernible, measurable mental health problem. So that is important, and you can see on the other two columns, we've compared that with Olympic sports, a sort of best and worst case scenario. So we cannot ignore the mental health side of things. In terms of the data collected from the license courses, as I say, all this needs to be context specific, because of course these folk were coming in for a course they had to pass, and so that's always going to create a certain degree of anxiety. In the license course, it was not screening for alcohol-related problems. And I guess the questions really are we actually recruiting in people who are better mental health than actually the current participants, or rather more concerning, does the sport actually cause mental health problems? And we know there are significant pressures amongst our jockeys. So as a consequence of this, we're developing a mental health strategy for the sport in the UK, and at the centre of that is our jockey athlete. And if you think about jockeys in the middle there, they are under pressures like the rest of us. So they have issues with their family, that we have issues with their family. We're probably seeing a little bit more alcohol and drug misuse in that group than we would like. They also have to contend with the athlete-related stuff. So that's failure. So not winning races. If you're someone who doesn't cope well with failure, don't become a jockey, because you're going to lose more than you win. Big issues with social media and abuse on social media. The constant concerns about injury risk and being stood down. If you want to make an athlete depressed, stop them playing their sport. So that's really important. And the issues going into retirement as well. Okay, so retirement, really big challenging time for athletes. They lose a lot of their identity as they go into retirement. And of course, we've then got the more specific racing side of things. So concerns about employment, autonomy, power relationships, weights, of course, as we know, have a big effect on people's mood, and the relentless timetable. So jockeys are exposed to considerable pressure. Now, what we're trying to do is actually using the pillars on the left-hand side is actually to construct around them a support network. So understanding their needs from their perspective, identifying early when there's a problem, trying to move away from actually waiting for a problem, but actually to promote positive mental health, but also to actually respond sensibly when there is an issue. And certainly the strategy is developing over time around the jockey. Their primary levels of support, like the rest of us, are people we meet, so families, friends, and other jockeys. And we're trying to construct around that an industry which actually is mindful of well-being in order that actually we don't inadvertently add to the burdens of this group. So one of the things we've done, for instance, is talking to the stewarding staff about how they run inquiries to do it in a way which is less burdensome. We've taught the stewards how to break bad news as well, because one of the challenges is often if you get a positive drugs test, you learn about it on a race course on a race day, and how that is delivered to you is a really important thing. So there's a sort of broad strategy which is developing over time. So coming back to our four corners, pleased to say that the FA, which was previously in the middle of this chart, has now been replaced by the jockey. So we're trying to be more jockey-centric and actually factoring all these aspects of the four corners. And then the other thing, which I'm really hoping will happen at some point, is that little elephant in the room will eventually leave the room if we can actually come up with a strategy which is going to tackle weights in the long term. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hill. Wearable technology is nowadays a part of all of our everyday lives.